Well, the tax reforms are one of the conditions the International Monetary Fund put in place when it extended a $723 million line of credit to Jordan in 2016. So why have they hit such a nerve with protesters? Well, I put that question to Denis Sullivan, a political science professor and the director of the Boston Consortium for Arab Region Studies at Northeastern University.
Well, these tax laws come on top of a series of other austerity measures. So for the average Jordanian, this is just piling on, frankly. Jordanians have been enduring and really bearing the burden of the Syrian refugee crisis for the past over 6 years, and added to this, these austerity measures, cuts in fuel subsidies, i.e. rising fuel prices, rising bread prices, rising sales tax, now rising income tax. It just got to be too much for the average Jordanian, and I don't just mean the average, the below average, the above average. These protests really cut across a variety of class and certainly gender divides, if you will.
Now, we understand that the goal of these reforms were to bring down debt and really tighten up the budget. But
yes.
What about the expected economic impact of these reforms? Is it going to have the result that they're hoping for?
The rise of taxes, I guess we won't know, honestly, for some time, because the king has come in and said, let's put a halt to this, let's rethink all this. Basically, it makes sense that Jordan raised taxes on more people, but I think it's really the issue of timing. As I mentioned just a moment ago, this has really just been piling on to the Jordanian people. The economy is really in dire shape here. 96% of GDP. They're in debt up to around $40 billion, which is about 96% of their GDP. And again, I have to say, this has to be considered in the context of the Syrian refugee crisis. The Jordanian government estimates that it has spent at least $10 billion over the last 6 years to take care of now well over 1 million Syrians who are refugees in Jordan. And so this is just, their budgets are blown, and they're blown year after year after year. So of course it makes sense to raise the taxes, but that only means to provide more services. Well, who's getting these services? Not the average Jordanian only, but this 1 million Syrians as well.
Now, Denis, some of the protesters are alleging that the Jordanian government is corrupt. What would they be basing that on, and how fair is that?
It's fair, I have to say. It's not like there have been no protests actually in Jordan over these past 7 years of when the Arab Spring erupted in Tunisia and Egypt and Yemen and Bahrain and Syria and Libya. Jordan was generally spared, but there were protests. There were weekly protests actually for the last 7 years actually, and they were all about corruption. Jordan is noted for being about the 60th most corrupt country in the world. Okay, it's not Russia, which is like 155 or something, and it's not Sweden, which is the third least corrupt, so to speak. So it's in that top third, or almost in the second third of corrupt countries in the world. So it's a fair criticism that there's corruption, and that is one of the greatest drivers of these protests. I talk to people all the time who've been going to the protests, or people who are praising the protests or applauding the protests, and they all start with corruption, and then they say, so we take this corruption and this top 1 or maybe 0.1% of Jordanians are benefiting from this economic system, and 99+% are not. And then they want us to bear, the average Jordanian to bear more of the taxes.
So, Denis, given everything at play, what the government is trying to achieve, what's really spoken to the nerve of the protesters, what is the best outcome from both sides' perspectives?
Well, I have to start with the fact that I think the king is safe. These protests are not against the king, specifically not against the king. They are very much against the government, which are actually His Majesty's government. But he has come out and called for a dialogue among members of parliament, trade unions, professional unions, and others. So that's really the best outcome if we could just, if the Jordanians actually would just put this tax bill on hold for the moment, and that seems to be what the king has insisted on, and what the next government is going to do. You put the tax bill on hold. You bring in parties like the unions, who are even more powerful today, 6 days after these protests, than they were a week ago. So the unions have really kind of come into their own even more than ever. Bring them to the table, have this dialogue, get to a longer-term implementation of these austerity measures. But this also, I have to also bring back the Syrian refugee crisis. This also is incumbent upon the friends of Jordan, the United States, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and many others, who see the stability of Jordan as key to the security of those countries I just mentioned.
Right.
And they too, we too, as an American, I can say this, we too need to increase our support for the government. And we're doing, again, as an American, I can say we're doing great to support the Jordanian government financially, but we just need to do so much more. Jordan is just really kind of overflowing at the seams, really bursting at the seams with the burden that it's bearing.